companies listed here, the Rotterdam Lloyd, the Stoomvaartmaatschappij Nederland, and the Stoomvaartmaatschappij Oceaan. And they form a conglomerate. They work together in the Kongsi which was essentially a monopoly over the shipping of Hajis between colonial Indonesia and the Middle East. Then I also look at the Java, China, Japan line. And this was connecting various ports in Indonesia with the coast of China and also to Japan. And then finally, I look at passenger shipping. So these passenger liners on big ships, which were moving not just people, but also cargo to and from Europe and colonial Indonesia. On the Rotterdam Lloyd and the Stoomvaartmaatschappij Nederland. Those are the first two on this map. And then also the KPM, which I'm sure probably you're very familiar with. The KPM is moving goods and people around within Indonesia itself. So I'll start off today. I'm just going to give you a brief overview of the book's arguments. And I'll start off by talking about the area of Hajj shipping. So my book begins pretty much in late 1926 and early 1927, following the sort of uprisings that are happening in Java and Sumatra. And the reason why I start there is that following these uprisings, the Dutch administration really starts this much more serious project of surveillance and policing over Indonesians. And essentially this project of surveillance doesn't exist just within Indonesia. It is actually expanded around the globe through these maritime networks. And more specifically, the colonial administration asks Dutch shipping companies to take part in this surveillance and policing projects. So essentially, Dutch shipping companies are working together with the colonial administration to sort of spread their surveillance network globally to actually track the movements of colonial subjects as they travel to various areas around the globe. And then in a few minutes, I'll talk about how these surveillance networks also existed in foreign port cities through the use of Dutch consulates. Dutch consulates were also used as this sort of surveillance tool by the colonial administration to expand the network of surveillance from the colony across the oceans and ultimately to foreign port cities. So one of the reasons why the Hajj became a very highly surveilled type of movement after 1926 and 27 in part has to do with the numbers that you see here on the screen. And when we look at why there was this sort of surge in numbers in 1926 and 27 and the 27-28 Hajj season, was largely because for a few years the Hajj ships were not actually traveling back and forth because of the unrest that was happening in the Middle East, essentially in the Saudi region. So there was a sort of backlog of people who wanted to go on Hajj, and that's why we have this sort of surge in numbers. But the Dutch administration believed that there was something more nefarious going on, and that in fact the reason why there were so many people traveling in 1926-27 and 27-28 is that there were more people who were trying to escape the sort of crackdowns and the sort of intense punishments that were happening after these uprisings. And they believed that many Indonesians were escaping the colony on board these ships under the guise of Hajis in order not to be persecuted for their role in these uprisings. So the three shipping companies that I discussed earlier, in Kangxi Tiga, these shipping companies owned a total monopoly over the transportation of Hajis from leaving from colonial Indonesian ports. And of course, there were people who were sort of getting around this monopoly by going to Singapore, for the most part, Singapore, and then traveling on from Singapore on board ships owned by largely other European nations. But from the Dutch ports, your only option would be to go on one of these Kangxi Tiga ships. And the sort of surveillance that happens on board the Hajj ships, and of course, you'll see here, this is a very sort of idealized imagery used by the Stoomvaart Maatschappij Nederland to sort of, appeal to possible really customers of people who will go on board their ships. In reality, the situations on board these Hajj ships were much more uncomfortable, and so part of what I look at is the ways that Dutch shipping companies sort of organize their space on board, the ways that they use segregation on board to actually keep what they called ordinary pilgrims, ordinary Indonesian pilgrims, from other groups on board who would be traveling on these ships, largely Hadrami Arabs who are moving from communities in the Middle East and in Southeast Asia, of sort of separating these two groups under the assumption that these other, that Arabs on board the Dutch ships actually would be sort of a bad influence on Indonesian pilgrims. So I look at that sort of segregation on board. And I also look at the way that Indonesians who are going on pilgrimage actually are able to use some of their consumer power to sort of push back against some of these regulations that are happening on board the Hajj ships. So because there are three shipping companies who make up this monopoly of Kangxi Tiga, there are sort of slight differences that happen between the three companies. So those differences include sort of whether or not your relatives could actually help you move your things onto the ship before the ship sailed, and sort of look around and help you get situated before the ship set sail. Food was also a very, very big part of how pilgrims decided which of these three companies to use. The safety records on board. So essentially, you have two of the shipping companies that have a higher death rate on board than the third, and that's largely because the Stoomvaart Maatschappij Oceaan, which is ultimately a British company, but it sails under Dutch flags. Their ships are airier. There's more space per pilgrim on board. They have some newer ships. So all of these small things ultimately meant that pilgrims could sort of choose which of the three companies to use. And I show that this sort of consumer power also led the other two shipping companies, the Stoomvaart Maatschappij Nederland and the Rotterdamse Lloyd, to actually change some of their policies to make the journey more comfortable. They bought some new ships and put them into their fleet. They increased the amount of sort of deck space per passenger on board, and they tried to improve this sort of menu that I have here, which is part of the 1922 Pilgrims Ordinance. They tried to sort of to make this a little bit better and to give a little bit more leeway for people actually bringing their own food on board and being able to cook their own food on board. So that's sort of what I talk about in chapter 1 of the book. And in chapter 5 of the book, I sort of continue on to look at the ways that this maritime voyage, the surveillance that's happening on board this maritime voyage, actually expands once pilgrims arrive Jeddah, the port of Jeddah, and then move on to their pilgrimage. And I'm essentially arguing that the Dutch use their colony in Jeddah as really sort of a spying organization where the vice consuls, the head consul is always a Dutch man, but the vice consuls are hired exclusively from Indonesia, and the rest of the staff is the council is Indonesian. And these workers, these consulate workers, are actually tasked with sort of going out and finding the Jawa community in Mecca and further afield, especially in cities like Cairo, and sort of finding out what people are doing, right? What are they doing in Mecca? Who are these, Indonesian colonial subjects? Who are they studying with? What are they actually learning? And the big fear was that Hajis returning home would bring these anti-colonial ideas based around this sort of pan-Islamism, really this global pan-Islamism that was certainly circulating throughout sort of these Hajj networks, that these anti-colonial ideas would travel back with the returning Hajis into their local communities when they arrived back. So that was the reason why this type of movement was surveilled so heavily. So ultimately, part of why I'm showing these images of, I'll just go back one. Oops. So, part of what this sort of the increasing level of documentation that people need to travel with their travel passes, other forms of identification, the many lists of names of passengers who are both traveling to Jeddah and back from Jeddah, all of these different immigration papers. These all make for this very bureaucratic sort of system of surveillance and tracking of Indonesian Muslims, both on during their maritime trip and when they are actually in the Middle East, and also when they return home, right? So when you return home, you also had to then do some more bureaucratic things of showing your papers again after you get back ashore. So it's a way to really, for the Dutch colonial administration to really track very heavily the movement of pilgrims around the globe. The next type of shipping that I look at is the Java, China, Japan line. And here you can see a map just specifically of those routes from 1939. And I look at this as really as a way to sort of track the movement of communism, both communist activists and communist ideology across and around Europe. And I look at this because communism was one of the other big concerns of the Dutch administration, right? And they also are, explaining and talking about the 1926, 1927 uprisings as being these sort of communist-based uprisings. And the idea that the Dutch administration had was that these communist ideas were sort of filtering into the island from abroad, right? The Dutch colonial administration had this concept that Indonesians were not necessarily displeased with the way that the Dutch were ruling, but that there were these sort of foreign infiltrators that were essentially causing this unrest. And obviously this was, if you actually look at the archival sources in the Netherlands from the Dutch perspective, it's very clear that the interviews that they do with people who are arrested after across 1927, that many of those people who are interviewed talk about the sort of dissatisfaction of the Dutch of Dutch rule, essentially, of all of these issues around Dutch rule, of judicial issues, of financial issues, of taxation issues, of all of these different concerns that actually are problems within sort of the Dutch bureaucracy. But instead, a lot of Dutch administrators choose to believe that this is actually an outside problem that is sort of coming into colonial Indonesia across the water, right, on board these ships. So this is a big reason why the Dutch colonial administration, in addition to sort of these Hajj networks, is also working very closely with this shipping company, the Java China Japan line, which is the largest, one of the largest Dutch shipping companies during the interwar period, the 1920s and 30s. And they're working with this company to actually, again, to create these sort of surveillance networks, to look at who's traveling on board, why they're traveling, where they're going, to keep an eye out for propaganda, to keep an eye out for smuggled weapons, smuggled, broadsheets and magazines and other propaganda materials. And the Dutch administration is particularly concerned about many Chinese sailors, the seamen who are working on board the JCJL ships. So part of what I talk about in chapter 2 is just to give an idea of how this company is changing during the 1920s and 30s, and how they're moving from a company that, in terms of their passengers, was primarily looking at, primarily they were shipping, their passengers were largely sort of indentured workers who were moving to various plantations and mines in colonial Indonesia from China. And in the 1920s and 30s, with some of the changes with the legal system around the penal sanction and the use of indentured labor, that they now are trying to attract this, what they see as being this sort of better class of passenger, right? These passengers who would travel in the second class and the first class on board. So here's just an example of one of the ships, of the kind of ideal passengers that are trying to be courted onto this ship. So that's part of, chapter 2 is talking about this company's position within Chinese markets, right? And their desire to try and create a monopoly over the shipment of goods between colonial Indonesia and China. Ultimately, they are not successful in creating this monopoly, but they try as hard as they can to mimic the kind of monopoly that happens, that Kangxi Tiga has over Hajj movements. So in chapter 5, I then have a similar investigation as the sort of surveillance networks in the Middle East, where I look at the ways that the Dutch use their consulates in China and Japan, but really I focus more on China, and I look very closely at Shanghai in particular, of the use of Dutch consulates in China and the way that these are consulates are sort of the foreign bases of policing and surveillance that are connecting the maritime workers to the shores, right, to these important port cities. So this is a cartoon that I wanted to include. Again, this is one of the sort of Dutch fears over the influx of communist ideology into colonial Indonesia, right? And that, again, the Dutch attitude was not necessarily that this was a homegrown movement, but that this was being sort of imposed on Indonesians from abroad, right? And here we have this idea of this Soviet wolf that's actually trying to weaken the power of Dutch imperialism through their infiltration and on Indonesians who are traveling around the globe. So yeah. Okay, so I look specifically at Shanghai as the center, and I explore in chapter 5 really the surveillance archive that's built by the Dutch in collaboration with the British and the French in Southeast Asia, and these three nations are working very closely together to share their intelligence, and in this case their intelligence around sort of communism and communist activists who are moving around the globe, and in fact are really using these maritime networks to sort of move around the globe. And there's some I think very inspiring stories about the ways that seamen are able to actually use the maritime world to create these very rich, highly connected communist networks around the globe. Okay, so I'm just going to skip that for right now. So the other type of shipping I look at are these large passenger liners that are run by the Rotterdam Lloyd and the Stoomvaartmaatschappij Nederland, that are running between Europe through the Mediterranean and the Red Sea and across the Indian Ocean onto Indonesia. And so these passenger ships are probably, some of the better known kinds of ships in terms of when people think about shipping in the 1920s and 30s. A lot of people, these images come to mind of these large ships. And so part of what I look at in chapter 3 are the ways that these ships served as a colonial classroom, really, to sort of teach people on board what is expected of them when they arrive in the colony. So I am largely looking at sort of Europeans who are traveling in the first and second classes on board these ships, and the different techniques that are built into sort of life on board the ship, to help Europeans sort of differentiate themselves from the colonial other, right? And to sort of prepare themselves to be in this position of power once they get to the colony. So I look at this in terms of the use of Indonesian workers on board the ships. And here you see the sort of the rice babos, or the nannies that are employed on board the ships, along with Indonesian stewards who are sort of serving the guests and cleaning their rooms and having a lot of interface with European passengers on board. And the European shipping companies would, for instance, when you got your booklet when you came on board that had a list of the sort of rules and regulations of the ship, it had a list of the other passengers if you wanted to plan your social events while you were sailing, but also it had a list of commands in Malay that you could already start practicing with these various employees, Indonesian employees on board. In addition to this, the shipping companies themselves would, one of the the so-called pastimes on board would be that European captains would bring groups of first and second class European passengers to view other non-European passengers who were traveling in the third class and also sometimes in the fourth class. So you actually would get a sort of tour, if you will, of these other, non-European passengers on board as part of the leisure schedule, part of the entertainment that was provided on board for Europeans. And this sort of gaze, right, this real European gaze over the other continued on when you arrived in colonial Indonesia, in the ways that you were expected to sort of interact with people on shore. And I look specifically at these what were called pleasure cruises that happened, where you would be able to stop and get off, and then you would get back on the ship and you would travel around. It was largely just these leisure tours on the KPM. And so I also look at sort of this interaction between Europeans and Indonesians within this early tourist structure, and ultimately looking at the ways that Indonesians themselves took advantage of this early tourism by sort of putting on these shows that were, you know, for a large part, these manufactured shows that Europeans wanted to see sort of the authentic culture of places like Bali and elsewhere. But ultimately, you know, the shows that were being put on were very constructed, and essentially were supposed to be giving Europeans what they wanted to see. And finally, chapter 6 of my book, I look at the Java, China, Japan lines connecting Japan and Indonesia, largely in the 1930s. So with the context of this, essentially, is that Japan has this growing economic influence in terms of their imports into Southeast Asia. And you can see that here, that the Netherlands is sort of losing their market position, if you will, within Indonesia, while Japan is sort of rising rising in terms of its exports into Indonesia in the 1930s. And this largely is connected with the sort of global downturn of the global depression that happens in the 1930s. But what's important here in terms of the shipping world is that Japanese shipping companies are now really very intense competitors of the JCJL ships. So you have these new shipping companies that I would say very aggressively, are now directly competing with Dutch shipping lines. So rather than sort of working within the conference system, or essentially the shipping conference system is largely where ships are, you know, it's very European based, where shipping companies sort of agree on the amount of the tonnage of cargo that they're going to split up. They agree upon the prices, so they set these prices. And Japan had been part of these conferences, but now as the 1930s progress, we have shipping companies that are actually breaking away from working cooperatively with European shipping companies in Asia, and are increasingly saying, like, we are not going to cooperate with you. We are going to be doing our own thing. And sort of the backdrop of this is that the Dutch administration is concerned about Japan's expansion in Asia. And this is, as we can see here in this cartoon, already in 1932, this concept of Japanese expansion is already on the radar of the Dutch administration, but also, this is from a Dutch newspaper in the Netherlands. People are already sort of aware of this, and I argue that you can sort of see this expansionism happening in the maritime world, you know, a few years before you actually have this sort of more aggressive official militaristic expansion policy of the co-prosperity sphere, which doesn't happen for a few years later than this, but sort of that the maritime world, you already can sort of see the beginnings of this conflict that would come to a head in the 1940s. So that's it. That's essentially my book, a short summary of my book. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you, Chris, for your presentation. It's very interesting subjects, yeah. Yeah. Also, I'm still have a lot of questions. And before we move into question and answer session with, I would like to raise an easy question about what is the challenge and difficulties that you found during your studies here, and what is still open for the research in the future regarding in line with your topics that you already elaborated.
Well, I think the biggest challenge for me is because I worked really primarily in Dutch archives, is understanding that the what I'm talking about here really is the sort of Dutch perspective on this type of business, right, and this type of surveillance. And so there's so much more research to be done. Obviously, when you write a book, there has to be a moment where you just stop, right? You can't go on forever. So, right. So the thing about this book is that it almost brings up more questions than it answers. Like there's so much more research to be done on the maritime world, especially in the sort of the geography of Indonesia. But I think, in Southeast Asia more broadly, that the maritime world, really needs to become more of a sort of centralized place where people are investigating what is actually happening on board the water and how is that connected to the terrestrial history. So, for me personally, I am right now sort of conceptualizing a new project, and I definitely am continuing on with maritime history, because I think that one of the things that's so fascinating about maritime history is that intellectually it can bring you to so many different places, right? This book is an example of how the maritime world really ties itself to writing these very global histories. And for people who are interested in world history, who are interested in networks, these global networks, the maritime world is really very rich for this kind of investigation. And I think it's understudied. Because a lot of the archives that I use for this project are these shipping company archives in the Netherlands that have hardly been used. Many researchers really haven't looked very closely through these archives and really analyzed these archives, and there's such rich sources of information. So I'm hoping that this book will spark people's interest in maritime history, and we can just grow the conversation.
Yes, it's very interesting because you mentioned about the anti-colonial movement in terms of network, rather than an isolated or just a particular activity in certain areas. So I think that's also one kind of issues that we can elaborate further, about the nature of anti-colonial movement or the colonial control itself. And we have participants here that may want to talk or want to discuss or raise issues. And Paulus Cakrawan, Paulus Cakrawan want to ask a question or make a comment. Silakan Pak Paulus.
Ya, terima kasih Pak Andi. Jadi sebentar saya hidupkan supaya enak. Oh, nggak bisa ya anunya dihidupkan. Oh baiklah ya. Terima kasih Pak Andi. Chris.
Silakan.
Yeah, I'm so appreciate your presentation. It's make me have a broader thinking about the shipping, transportation effect for the many things in Indonesia, especially anti-colonialism and so on. And then I was surprised that with your theory that when the farmer make an uprising in 1926, right, in Indonesia and several places in Banten and the others. This, yes, we knew is from the left, that is supported from the left, say communism or socialism, whatever. I thought before that this communism at the time just came from the Dutch communists at the time, but I didn't think that it was also came from the communication because of the shipping, right? From the China, maybe in the Vladivostok over there, a lot of the left movement over there, and then this surprising me. And then the second one, it is about the you mentioned about the KPM, Koning Lake Packet Fart Maskapai become Pelni now in Indonesia. It is have a role also in this your research. And the second one, it is about the Malaysia. As you already mentioned, in the Dutch, we call it Malaysia or Great Depression at the time. Maybe in your book, you read or mentioning more deeply in the Great Depression. What is the effect of the Great Depression in the shipping, right? Because you know that the Great Depression is a inside of in your range, right? Time or year. You're mentioning from 26 until 36, right? And the Great Depression is about in the 1930 or something.
Mhm.
And this is what is the effect, the Great Depression of the whole picture or of the transportation over there, shipping. And the third one is about the pan-Islamism. Pan-Islamism, we knew it was started and then by the movement, right? End of 19th century by Jamaluddin al-Afghani, if I'm not wrong. And then what is the effect also to Indonesian movement, anti-colonialism? How big, how far? We knew that in the 1908, we already started to have a, say, quote to quote, modern organization, anti-colonialism, and so on and so on and so on. But and how far this effect to the movement, the independence movement in Indonesia, and so on and so on.
Mhm.
Okay, this is a short, question from me. Maybe you could, give me more depth information. But sorry, I didn't read your book now, but I will buy and I'll read your book. It's very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you so
Thank you,
much.
Pak Paulus. Mhm.
Yeah, that's a great set
Uh,
of issues that you raise and questions. Yeah, so just to start answering them, yes, I mean, definitely by the late 1920s, there is a very sort of global communist networks that have already been really pretty highly developed, I would say, by that time. And part of that is the pressure of the Comintern, which is the sort of international branch of the communist government in Russia, that is really sort of pressing this international agenda. And there's lots of testimony within the colonial government archives. These were secret archives, but now you can look at them, of interviewing of seamen, these sailors who are traveling to the KUTV, which is in Moscow. That's the University for Toilers of the Far East, where you go through a 2-year sort of training program where you're meant to sort of return back to your home and actually sort of spread communism, to build these communist cells. So yeah, I think it's a very fascinating history, and definitely is not just coming in through these Dutch activists like Snæfleet or Maring, right? And he's really, he's so well known, and he plays such an important role. But there are other, there's a whole network that's happening in the 1920s. in terms of the depression in the 1930s, all of the Dutch shipping companies feel the depression in terms of these sort of falling numbers of passengers and total cargo tonnage. So this is true for the Kongsberg ships, the Hajj ships. There are much fewer pilgrims who are traveling in the 1930s. There is more competition for a lot of Dutch shipping companies because there are fewer people and there's less cargo. So the competition really increases a lot. But the Dutch shipping companies themselves, by the time they get to the early 1930s, they have made so much money by that time, in large part because Dutch shipping companies worked together with the colonial government to have these legalized monopolies over shipping. This was true for KPM, and it was true for the other shipping companies that I talk about in the book, that they have accumulated so much wealth that the larger Dutch shipping companies can very easily absorb the losses in the 1930s. It doesn't put them out of business. It puts them a little bit in a moment of crisis, and they have to discuss what they're doing. But ultimately, none of them are in danger of closing or going bankrupt or anything like that, because they have amassed so much wealth in the decades prior to the 1930s. So that's sort of how the shipping companies experience the depression. And, yeah, I guess that's my answer to that. And then in terms of pan-Islamism, I mean, there are so many scholars who work very specifically on pan-Islamism as a movement, as a global movement. And so, my knowledge of pan-Islamism during the 1920s and 30s is that it's a very strong movement. If you look at what's happening in Mecca, in the Hajj, you have a collection of people who are pilgrims who are there, but also communities who live there from around the globe. In terms of Indonesian Hajis, many Hajis go there and stay for a number of years for further education. There are a lot of Indonesians who move from Mecca onto Cairo and are enrolled in different various educational institutions there. And there is the archives are filled with this information from different nations who during the 1920s and 30s are going through their own sort of anti-colonial struggles against various imperial administrations, British and French. And so the Hajj is, I think, a real place of empowerment for a lot of people who are using the concepts of pan-Islamism to sort of create these alternative models to the imperial system that I think people are very hopeful about, right? For different nationalists who are hoping that pan-Islamism can create or help create a sort of basis or an understanding to get more people to be in favor of nationalism around the globe. And yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. There are still a lot of questions, for you from chat rooms and question and answer, but I would like to raise the question from YouTube, participant who follow this discussion from YouTube. I will read it to you. It's from Ferdinand Victoria. He said, you mentioned intelligence collaboration among French, British, and Dutch. How about American-Dutch intelligence collaboration with regard to Indonesia-Filipina connections in the interwar years? Thank you. Thank you, Ferdinand.
Thanks so much for your question.
Yeah.
Yes, it's so interesting because because the French, the British, and the Dutch are very intertwined with each other. in terms of their sharing of intelligence. And it's very interesting because the Americans and American intelligence and really the American government is not interested in participating in this intelligence sharing, which is interesting because there's been so much work that's been done on the United States' interactions with Indonesia as we move, post World War II, that you would think that the United States would have been more involved in this intelligence sharing, but they were not. And they were, essentially courted by the British, the Dutch, and the French to participate in this intelligence sharing. And the United States government said no. So they actually were not part of this. They were not part of this intelligence sharing, which I was surprised at. I thought that they would be, because they obviously had an interest in what was happening in Southeast Asia during the 1920s and 30s. Yeah.
There's another question in Q&A. It's from Anika Setyadharma. Thank you, Anika. She has two questions. I'm wondering about what do you think about the difference between anti-colonial networks and ideas spread through the ocean and land, and how this network cross and influence each other? That's the first question. And the second question, the business competition that you mentioned is not just about commercial interest, but also more about sovereignty and jurisdiction. Can you elaborate more on how shipping company involved in the boundary making of modern state jurisdiction? Okay.
Can you just repeat that second question again? Because it cut out for a second.
The second question, sorry. The business competition that you mentioned is not just about commercial interest, but also more about sovereignty and jurisdiction. Can you elaborate more on how shipping company involved in the boundary making of modern state jurisdiction?
Okay, great.
Is that clear?
Yes, very interesting questions. Yeah, the ocean and land networks, the anti-colonial networks. So, I mean, ultimately part of what I look at is one of the big theoretical complications of this book that I really had to think about was, what is the difference between imperialism at sea and imperialism on land, right? Well, what are the different qualities of these two types of spaces? And, partially one of the major fundamental differences is that sort of the policing tools that the Dutch government uses on land in colonial Indonesia are not really totally available to them, both at sea, on the oceans, and in foreign port cities. So part of the argument of this book is that the colonial network is that the government has to use sort of alternative ways of implementing control over colonial subjects when they're outside of the actual terrestrial landmass of the colony. And so part of what I'm sort of looking at is how that control was implemented. And a big part of that is through this collaborative work with Dutch companies, with Dutch businesses, in particular the shipping companies, and also these sort of foreign consulates. So in a way, it's partially a story about how the Dutch government sort of co-opts shipping companies to really become these sort of police entities, right? That are not just business entities and not just maintaining the economic well-being of the colony, but now we're actually involved in this sort of social struggles that are happening in the interwar period in the 1920s and 30s. So part of what I'm arguing is that businesses are not just these sort of economic these economic entities, that they need to be investigated more fully to show that the various ways that they work and collaborate with the colonial bureaucracy and with the colonial government. So that was one of the, the interesting things that I was writing about, I thought, in terms of the ways that imperial businesses work during the early 20th century. And then in terms of the ways that shipping companies set up sort of boundaries, I mean, it's very interesting. Maritime law is its own subject that has so much research has been done about the ways that water has been sort of carved up, right? And we see that today on the map. If you look at a map today of the oceans, so much of the ocean is owned by these nation states that have made claims about what parts of the water they own, and essentially becomes an extension of the nation state. In the 1920s and 30s, this idea of water being sort of owned by nation states is still sort of just developing. So the idea of sort of these boundaries that happen within the water are not as inscribed into law or into national policy as they will be as we move through the later 20th century. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for your response. And we still have another question here from the chat room. From Khairul Astik, amazing prof. Could you explain again more detail what caused the number of pilgrimages from all colonial areas was dropped dramatically in 1930s? Is it linked with communism uprising during 1920s and nationalist movement? And yeah,
the drop in the number of Hajis.
Right.
Say it one more time. The drop in Hajis, the movement of Hajis.
The drop in Hajis.
Okay.
In 1930s, is it linked with communism uprising during 1920s and nationalist movement? And before you answer the question, I would like to tell the participants, kalau ada yang ingin menyampaikan melalui bahasa Indonesia silakan, atau bahasa Inggris silakan pertanyaannya disampaikan melalui chat atau question and answer, atau juga mengangkat tangan, raise your hands untuk bisa bicara langsung dengan Chris. Thank you. Okay, Chris, can go on.
Okay, thanks. So it's an interesting question. I think that the primary reason why the numbers drop really has more to do with economic reasons, because as I'm sure many people know, that pilgrims who are traveling to the Middle East very often are being sponsored essentially by their community, by their religious community, their family. And in the 1930s, we do see that there is sort of a loss of some of the income that's happening in the Netherlands, and also in colonial Indonesia. So part of that fall is economic, and you also see that. So I'm not totally sure that's a direct correlation between communism and pan-Islamism and that drop in numbers, because ultimately the Dutch government is not putting sort of a cap on the number of people who can travel. The shipping companies are not trying to make these numbers smaller. They're trying to grow their business. They're trying to get more passengers. The Dutch government wants as many passengers as it can, because they are essentially they want the Dutch national shipping companies to earn as much money as possible, right? In terms of the colonial government and colonial businesses, they are on the same page in terms of wanting to earn as much as possible. So, you know, so economic reasons are one thing. Also, I think more people are choosing to travel to Jeddah on board non-Dutch ships. And essentially the way that this happens is that you would first leave colonial Indonesia, go to, you know, another port like Hong Kong or Singapore, and then take a ship from there and sail. Some people did also take an overland route where you would sort of sail onto the Asian subcontinent or India, and then you would take an overland route. So there are more people who are using alternative forms of transportation, and some of that may be explainable, that is seen as sort of an anti-colonial act in and of itself, right? To sort of circumvent the Dutch monopoly, that is sort of a way to take a stance against sort of the Dutch monopoly over Hajj shipping. But I haven't really found a lot of evidence of that, right? So that may be true, but more often you hear people explain that choice because it's considered to be less expensive, or that they've heard that the ships that leave from Hong Kong and Singapore are better ships, that they're more spacious, that they're more comfortable, that you can cook your own food on board, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't know if I necessarily would make that connection. But another interesting thing about the Hajj in the 1930s is one thing you do see is that there is sort of this increased impoverishment of the Indonesian community in Mecca. And there's sort of a flood of people who are looking to leave the Middle East and return home to Indonesia. And this creates its own sort of big problem with both the Dutch colonial administration and the shipping companies, because now in Jeddah, you have this increasing numbers of Indonesians who don't have enough money for their return fare, or who have sold their return ticket to someone else and no longer can get back. And there is sort of a large discussion and an agreement between Kongsi Tiga ships and the Dutch colonial government to essentially repatriate a lot of these destitute pilgrims who no longer have the funds to return, in part because the Dutch colonial administration is worried about what that says about Dutch competence, essentially the competence of the Dutch Empire and of Dutch imperialism to this global stage, really, because there are so many people from all around the globe who are there in Mecca, in Jeddah, who are seeing these sort of destitute pilgrims. And of course, this is true not just for Indonesian pilgrims. There's, this is happening to pilgrims from many different areas who are looking to repatriate in the 1930s. Anyway, so that's like another something else I talk about in my book. Yeah. So hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah. We still have another questions. A lot of questions tonight. Yeah. Tonight in Indonesia. And it's still in early morning in America. Yeah. From Anonymous. Yeah. He said that he or she, I don't know, you just respond about 1930s Great Depression. As far as I know, and the archive studies I am currently working, 1600s, people arriving and departing is having their information notarized. Yeah, notarized. There were kind of archives, and one of them was called Borgtocht. I think the more appropriate term today is verzekering or insurance. I wonder if you ever met archives about Borgtocht or verzekering or insurance to corroborate your analysis about shipping companies and the activities in shipping itself. Okay, thank you. Can you respond it now?
Yeah. Sure. Well, not really. I would say that that sort of aspect of shipping, the versakering or the insurance, that's not really something I talk too much about in my book. I was more sort of interested in looking at these shipping companies, less from sort of the business side, and I would say more from the a business's role as sort of this political entity in and of itself, right? And also part of the sort of the imperial culture of, really being sort of a type of ambassador that helps to instill the same kind of colonial hierarchies that are happening in colonial Indonesia, of trying to sort of set up those same hierarchies and that same sort of hegemonic system outside of the borders of Indonesia itself. So I was looking more, in terms of the analysis of these businesses, of shipping companies as an actual business. I was sort of stepping away from, I think, a more the more common, more traditional ways of analyzing businesses, into sort of looking through this political, social, cultural lens of who were these actual people working at the business, and how did their place within the colonial system, how did their place within the colonial hierarchies, how did their place within colonial hegemony, how did that impact the kind of business decisions that they then were going to be, that they made, right? So essentially, I'm trying to sort of show that businesses are not just sort of these faceless entities that work solely for profit, and that earning the most profit is the ultimate goal. That actually there's like a competing goals that are happening for colonial businesses in terms of their collaboration with the colonial system more broadly.
Thank you. We still have 20 minutes to go. And we still have 2 questions. Is that okay? And 3, yeah. Actually. From YouTube first, yeah. There are 2 questions. First from Ferdinand. Ferdinand has another question here. He asked, do you have an estimate on how many arrests the Dutch made at the colony's port of entry that were linked to suspect anti-colonial activities, like getting caught with propaganda materials? That's from Ferdinand, the first question. And the second question from Belajar Sejarah You, I don't know the Nico France, from Nico France. He asked, but what about rivalry between Singapore port and Tanjung Priok port during 1920s and 1930s? That's the second question.
Okay. All right. So first, the how many arrests were made. It's a very interesting question, because it's much less than you would think. So I actually, the archives don't really have a specific number of people who were arrested. And part of the problem with sort of arresting people during the 1920s and 30s is that the Dutch, although they interrogated many people through these foreign consulates abroad, right? So within colonial Indonesia, there was their own policing and surveillance structure, the Algemene Recherchedienst. So that was its own sort of structure. Abroad, you have these Dutch consulates and the consulate workers who are essentially, interrogating people who come in for assistance to the consulate, or they've lost their papers and they need assistance, or they need monetary assistance. Like, there are a number of reasons why people would go to a foreign consulate while you're abroad. And that's when the consulates would actually start interrogating these people, would take down these very long statements that are in the archives about who these people were, where they were from, where they had been, what they're doing. And the thing is that intelligence during the 1920s and 30s, like colonial intelligence, wasn't perfect, right? So there's a lot of sort of missed connections, if you will, where someone will come in and the Dutch consulate will wind up giving them some money or giving them a voucher for a place to stay, or some other sort of assistance like that. And only later on will realize, after they get a communication from, from the French, something like the French concession police in Shanghai, that they realize, oh, that person who came in may have come in under an alias, and they may actually be this person who the French just, saw in Shanghai, and then the person left. And so it's, so the researcher, doing research around this it's sort of like a game of cat and mouse in a way, where, many people are, essentially like gaming the system in terms of using aliases, in terms of using forged documents, so as not to be caught by the colonial surveillance entities. So that's sort of more what I found, rather than actually people being arrested. Was much more often people were not being arrested, and we're getting away with things. And then in terms of the ports, what exactly did the person want to know about the ports, or what was the question about the ports of Singapore and Tanjung Priok? Oh wait, I think you're muted. Okay, Andy, will you unmute yourself? Because you're muted right now.
Sorry. The question is about the rivalry between Singapore port and Tanjung Priok port during 1920s and 1930s.
Yeah, that's a good question. The rivalry between them, I don't know. I would say that the one big difference is that Singapore is more of a, I think of Singapore as being a very sort of global port. And also, of course, Tanjung Priok is also a very global port. But yeah, I don't know. I don't exactly know what I would say about the rivalry. They're both very important ports in Southeast Asia. They both have so many tons of cargo passing through them, so many workers, maritime workers passing through both ports, so many passengers passing through both ports. So, the things that I'm talking about the differences of the ports, or why someone would sail from Singapore versus from the Dutch, the Dutch controlled ports in colonial Indonesia, essentially, yeah, the Singapore offers a variety of different shipping companies from a variety of different nations, from a variety of different European nations, but also Chinese ships and Japanese ships. That's true also of Tanjung Priok, but it's also true that the Dutch are implementing more and more, especially in the 1930s, more and more regulations around, for instance, passengers who are arriving have this sort of increasing need for landing permits, to actually pay money to come into Indonesia. They're, so it becomes the bureaucracy around global travel increases across the board in the 1920s and 30s as you have this growing colonial sort of surveillance network, especially in Asia, but not just within the sort of Dutch Empire, but also the British and the French as well, and the American Pacific as well. So the 1930s sees a real increase in sort of paper, right? The bureaucracy of what you actually need to travel around the globe. And so I would say that is a big difference between the sort of British controlled ports and Dutch controlled ports, is that the British and the Dutch are implementing these changes sort of at different paces, at different stages. So it also at certain times might be easier for one to move in and out through Singapore, and then to take a more local boat from Singapore to a smaller port in Indonesia. Yeah.
Yeah. We still have one more question. I think the last questions, yeah. From Wahyu Susilo. He asked about the Hajj business in the early 20th century. So it was mainly organized by Arab Christian group here in the Netherlands Indies. He asked, they were also another groups like Europeans or the Chinese involved in this Hajj business or pilgrimage organization, something like that. Yeah.
Yeah. So, right. I mean, I'm sure that many people here today are familiar with, the system, the use of sheikhs and sort of these pilgrim brokers, in essence, who are organizing trips. And that, pilgrims are sort of chaperoned both on the ship over and then usually transferred to a sort of more local sheikh chaperone who then helps them through the pilgrimage, and that whole thing sort of prepares the pilgrims for what they will need to do. And so that, yes, those positions are filled by a lot of Arab people who are living in colonial Indonesia during the 1920s and 30s, but also Hajis who've already done the Hajj, who are from Indonesia, who then go on to serve as these sort of chaperones. And the Dutch shipping companies, at least, are really always looking to try and find a way to get rid of these brokers. So the Dutch shipping companies really are always trying to be in control of everything at all times. And these brokers are seen by the shipping companies, at least, as an interference. Because they have more power on board, the Dutch shipping companies are very suspicious of their position within this whole structure, and are looking for ways to sort of eliminate this position of the Haji broker. But ultimately that doesn't happen, right? I mean, was really just something that the shipping companies sort of wished could happen, but never did happen. But one of the things I talk about in my book is an attempt in 1930 by Muhammadiyah, that Islamic organization Muhammadiyah, to actually start chartering their own Hajj ships. And they have a plan in 1930 to charter 2 Hajj ships for the following season. And there's a lot of support. Muhammadiyah is saying that this is a religious-based and cultural-based necessity, that that Muslims should have shipping to and from the Middle East in their own hands, right? And some even suggest that it is, you know, that it is sort of sacrilege if you are traveling with a European ship to and from the Hajj. That was maybe a little bit more of an extreme interpretation of it. But the Dutch government and the shipping companies worked together to uphold these colonial laws that make it nearly impossible for any kind of Indonesian shipping company to participate in this this business. So they sort of reinforced a law that says that you need 90,000 guilders, which is a huge amount at that time, that you need 90,000 guilders of, you know, collateral in essence to actually have a Hajj ship leave officially from a Hajj port. And Muhammadiyah is on its way to collecting that amount of money. And ultimately then the Dutch government in a meeting with the shipping company executives in Batavia, in this meeting, they decide that actually the 90,000 euros can only be held at a Dutch bank. And that is sort of the kiss of death of this attempt at sort of Muhammadiyah's shipping lines, because they can't find a Dutch bank who will help them. In essence, this is because the Dutch bankers and the Dutch shipping company and the Dutch administration, these are all people who come from the same social milieu in the Netherlands and are all sort of working together and are sort of actively trying to keep hold of this monopoly over Hajj shipping. So it's a really it's an interesting moment in the history of Hajj shipping that again, it's in my book if you want to read more about.
Okay, from this session, and Chris, do you still have another last words for this session?
Yeah, I just want to say thank you so much for all of these wonderful questions, and I'm always available to chat more with you if you want to send me an email. It's just kalexanderson@pacific.edu. I'd be happy to talk with any of you more, share more about the book or more about my research, more about the archives in the Netherlands, if anyone's looking to use the archives in the Netherlands. And it's been a wonderful morning. I'm just starting my day, so this is a great start to my
day. Thank you, Chris. And it's also it's very kind of you to participate in this session. And I think, as you mentioned, that here from in Indonesia, if the participants or others who want to expand or participate in the studies about you already discussed here, and you can contact directly to Chris, and Chris already open to us about new possibilities to dig more about the maritime world issues that related with not only about the economic but also cultural and political problems in Indonesian history. So thank you very much, and don't forget to buy her books. I'm just order it. Very interesting books. Terima kasih banyak buat yang sudah hadir di sini. Terus nanti kita mengikuti dalam agenda lecture MSc selanjutnya. Tetap berhubungan dengan kami dan juga silakan untuk bisa berhubungan langsung dengan Chris. Chris, do you have an email? Can you put it in chat? Yeah, just type it in chat so it's make more easier for them. Okay.
There you go.
Okay. Thank you very much. So saya kembalikan ke Pak Usof. Thank you, Chris.
Thank
Keep
you.
in touch.
Thank you.
Stay healthy.
You too.
Ya, terima kasih kepada seluruh hadirin yang sudah menyaksikan webinar ini. Untuk rekaman dari webinar ini bisa disaksikan melalui YouTube channel Masyarakat Sejarawan Indonesia ya. Nantikan webinar
Terima kasih.
seri lecture selanjutnya. Sampai jumpa. Oke, udah Mas.
Udah. Oke ya. Liv ya. Thank you banyak ya, Ausop
Oke.
ya.
Yuk,
Thank
Mas.
you. Terima kasih. Saya N ya, yang saya yang
Ya.
hapuskan.